Time now for perspective. Human Rights Watch has just released its annual assessment of the state of human rights around the world, following a year defined in so many ways by the health and social ramifications of the global coronavirus pandemic. Other major concerns for rights campaigners this past year, including police violence and the ongoing discrimination faced by China's Muslim Uighur minority. My guest today is Kenneth Roth, Executive Director of Human Rights Watch. Thank you very much indeed for speaking to us here on France 24 today. Now, we know the pandemic has claimed almost 2 million lives so far, but billions, of course, were affected by lockdowns around the world. What are the key ways, in your opinion, that the pandemic has impacted global human rights?
Well, we've seen a number of governments use the pandemic as a pretext to solidify their power and silence critics. You just mentioned the election taking place in Uganda today. That's a perfect example. President Museveni cited the pandemic to prevent campaigning by his principal opponent, Bobi Wine, while his rallies went forward. And we've seen, in Europe, Viktor Orban, the Hungarian prime minister, did something similar. He seized dictatorial powers, the ability to rule by decree without parliament, citing the ability to serve the people of Hungary. But in fact, without any accountability, what he typically does is take European Union funds, build football stadiums to pay off his cronies. Meanwhile, Hungarian hospitals are absolutely decrepit. And so I think what we've learned is that in a pandemic particularly, the free flow of information and the ability to criticize how a government is responding is essential to public health. And that goes right back to Wuhan in the beginning, where the Chinese government's silencing of the whistleblowers for 3 weeks, the doctors who were trying to warn us about human-to-human transmission, that enabled the virus to go global. Because during those 3 weeks, millions of people fled Wuhan and 3,500 people a day flew abroad. So we've learned you need human rights, in essence, free debate, to best serve the people, particularly with a public health crisis like the pandemic.
And we know, of course, that the pandemic led to lockdowns around the world, some of which, of course, are still ongoing. We know that lockdowns, in turn, exacerbated the gender gap, with women disproportionately staying at home to look after the family, to cook, to clean, to educate children as schools were closed. Why were women disproportionately affected by lockdowns?
Well, one thing I would add to your list there is that women suffered a great increase in domestic violence because they were shut in with sometimes abusive partners. And so, this in a sense reflects ongoing, discrimination in gender roles and the burden of caring for children who suddenly couldn't go to school, the necessity of just trying to cope when even going to the grocery store was a challenge. This disproportionately fell on women. And so I think in many ways, the pandemic has spotlighted for us some of these disparities in society. And it's not simply gender disparities, it's also racial and ethnic disparities. Often the racial and ethnic minorities in a society were the ones who were more likely to fall ill, more likely to die, less likely to have access to the health care they need. And so this, the pandemic, if you want to find a silver lining in it, it should spur us to address these disparities, to ensure that everybody has access to health care, that everybody has the ability to feed their family, even if they lost their job because of the lockdown, and that, of course, that all children have a right to education, even if their family can't afford an internet connection or a laptop to allow remote schooling. These disparities in society have really come to the fore during this pandemic.
Now, changing tack slightly, we have just seen, of course, Trump impeached for a second time at the end of a term that his critics say was characterised by a number of abuses perpetrated against minorities, specifically against migrants and also the country's African-American community. How concerned were you by this, and do you think much will change under the Biden administration?
Well, we were deeply concerned by Trump's, overt encouragement of white supremacists, his attacks on immigrants, and as we saw just last week, his attacks on democracy. He spent months trying to suppress the right to vote of various minorities, and then, he encouraged a mob that went and tried to stop Congress from certifying Joe Biden's victory in the election. So I think the big challenge for Biden is how to redeem U.S. government credibility on human rights, both at home and abroad. one important thing for him to do is to let justice run its course. Impeachment is obviously a political determination that Trump is unfit for office. But that's separate from the question, did he violate the criminal law? And there are many cases where he very well might have. Biden was vice president under Obama, and Obama faced a similar problem with torture under Bush, his predecessor. And Obama said, we're going to look forward, not back. And he blocked prosecution of that torture. I think that was a big mistake. It suggested that the president was somehow above the law, which may even have encouraged Trump. So I think it's essential that Biden, not order Trump's prosecution. That would be politicizing the matter, but allow professional prosecutors to assess the evidence and decide, did Trump violate the law when he fomented this mob that attacked Capitol Hill, when he called Georgia election officials asking them to find 11,000 more votes? There are numerous things that Trump has done. These should be examined and a prosecution allowed to go forward to show that the president is not above the law. That, as Biden put it, the president is not a king.
Now, we touched on it just there. Police brutality has, of course, been a huge issue in the United States this past year, but also here in France with the recent beating of a black man by police officers, sparking mass protests. That, of course, as the French government continues to push ahead with its security law that many say would make it harder to expose abuses by French police. What is your take on that proposed legislation here in France?
Well, my view is that it's completely wrong to prohibit filming or photographing police in confrontations. In the incident you mentioned, the only reason that the government has taken seriously the obvious case of police brutality there is that there was a video of it. And that's typically the case. If an abuse takes place in a back room and it's just the victim's word against the police officer's word, the police officer always prevails, and basically impunity encourages more brutality of that sort. So the ability for journalists or ordinary citizens to take out their phone and film a confrontation between the police or just an arrest as a way of guarding against abuse is an essential tool. And it's not a matter of, security to prohibit that. That would just underwrite impunity. So I'm glad the government is reconsidering. I hope it completely takes that idea off the table.
And how have you seen the situation in France? Have you been surprised at that bubbling anger that's felt by so many here in France towards authorities when it comes to alleged police brutality and racism?
Well, on the question of racism, that also is very much mixed up with the issue of Islam. And here again, I don't think the government is getting it right. Everybody understands France's tradition of laïcisme, the secularism, where the government is supposed to be neutral with respect to religion, and that's fine. But the government seems to be taking it the next step and really clamping down on Islam. And that's a mistake. It's one thing to go after violent extremist Islam. By all means, nobody wants to support terrorism. But it's essential to distinguish between the handful of people who engage in violence, even if it's religiously motivated, from the vast majority of people who simply, have their own way of praying to God. And if the government, takes this laïcisme tradition and uses it as a cudgel to really clamp down on Islam as a whole, that's both wrong as a matter of freedom of religion, but it also is going to be completely counterproductive because that's the kind of response that fuels the anger you mentioned and that ends up encouraging the jihadist recruiters.
Now, speaking of freedom of religion, in the past year we have seen a lot of reports detailing terrible treatment of China's Muslim Uighur minority, including, of course, mass arbitrary arrests of the population. Beijing, of course, denying those allegations. What's being done to help China's Uighur minority, and is it working? Is it enough?
Well, you're completely right that China has detained, well over 1 million Uighur and other Turkic Muslims, essentially to force them to abandon Islam and to abandon their culture. And they also have imposed this incredibly intense surveillance state in Xinjiang, monitoring, really every aspect of people's lives there. Now, fortunately, the world is responding. We saw in October an unprecedented 40 governments banded together at the United Nations to condemn the repression in Xinjiang. That was very important, and China, clearly felt the heat. It felt compelled to respond. Now, one of the things China is doing is they're saying, they never admit that these are detention centers. They say that they're so-called vocational training centers. And now they said people are graduating, which is their way, I guess, of saying that they're releasing some people. But they seem to be releasing them into forced labor, which is the new issue. And so one big way to pressure China to stop the forced labor of Uyghur Muslims is to ensure that companies' supply chains from China are free of forced labor. And the truth is, right now, there's no way to tell because China doesn't permit independent inspections. So I think the lesson should be, unless China opens up and allows independent investigators to look at what's happening in Xinjiang, nobody can have confidence that their supply chain out of not only Xinjiang alone, but China as a whole, is free from this forced labor. And of course, every company has a duty to ensure that it's not complicit in forced labor.
Kenneth Roth, Executive Director of Human Rights Watch, thank you very much for taking the time to speak to us today.